And if Scotland was independent, do you think it would be a successful, normal, well-functioning European economy like Finland, Denmark, or Norway?
But that would be the aspiration. There's no reason on paper why it shouldn't be. It's just that the process of actually getting there is hard. And I think that's on the people supporting independence side to say how it would happen. Because what you get at the minute is a lot of sort of dancing around some sets of issues about, okay, we'd all like to be Finland. I mean, if you say what would an independent Scotland be like? And everyone says Finland or Norway or Sweden or something, which is not unreasonable, right? To think that this is possible. It's similar population, similar, these are all sort of developed economies. There's lots and lots of things going on there. There's industry in Scotland. There's lots of potential. The Scottish government talks all of this up. You could see plausibly how you might get there, and much more egalitarian, much better public services, all this sort of thing. It's just the process of getting there. Once you start thinking, okay, well, what kind of currency are you going to use? What are you going to do about Scotland's bank liabilities? What are you going to do about the debt, the government debt that as part of the UK potentially exists for Scotland? Of course, the position of the SNP is you get rid of all of it. Would the British government let you do that? Potentially not. So there's this huge set of complications where actually what the SNP in particular tries to present as a break that will be quite easy and then you just sort of turn into Finland in 20 years' time is actually going to involve a real rupture and a break with how the United Kingdom operates and therefore how Scotland operates. And that break is going to be more radical than anything the SNP leadership likes to talk about. You need to get into a more serious conversation about the distribution of wealth income in Scotland, that you don't get to be Finland given the resources that you have at hand. I mean, you don't get to be Finland for a whole load of reasons, but at least part of that is, well, then your tax system is going to have to look different, that you're going to have to do something about inequality in Scotland, put it like that you're going to have to try and raise money from somewhere, that there may, depending on currency arrangements, be some capacity for this hypothetical independent Scottish government to try and raise money, to borrow money and this sort of thing, but there may actually be significant limitations on its capacity to do that a new Scottish currency would be something that exists out in the world with loads and loads of other currencies. There's no guarantee that its value will be sustained in that world. It's not actually an easy thing to manage an independent currency in a world of lots of different competing currencies. I just had just reading through, I've forgotten the sort of aspirational title of it, the Scottish government's 10-year plan for, the economy. Which has lots of sort of nice words in it, and then the actual content is a little bit short of matching up to those nice words. But in terms of what the Scottish government has said it is committed to, things like a well-being economy and the idea that we're not just going to think about GDP forever, but actually the economy sits in a wider society, a wider environment, and our starting point should be what kind of society do we want to live in? How do we make the economy match up to that? Not how do we make the economy work? Let's get society to fit into it, right? And well-being sort of captures that. And the idea of well-being accountancy, which the New Zealand government has introduced, is potentially quite a radical way to think about doing economics in general and for governments to think about it. It can also be less radical. It's also just something you slap on and say, look, here's well-being, it's gone up 0.3, and it's like, well, so what? But if you take it in the round, it's like, okay, this may well involve exactly what I was talking about, thinking about how people work, where they work, when they work. How can you give them more meaningful flexibility about that? How do you alter the so-called work-life balance, all sorts of things? That can tie into well-being, or a well-being approach to this quite neatly. That's one thing there. The other bit is moving towards a Scottish investment bank. I mean, as mentioned, it would be great to have, certainly for England, regional investment banks of a similar scale. I mean, just on the population size, Yorkshire's bit smaller than Scotland, but why doesn't it also have an investment bank like this that functioned as a bank, as a public bank, so it could do what banks should do, which is create money in the creation of loans, direct those loans towards supporting small businesses, green investment, social investment of various sorts, and put that under the democratic control of people in Yorkshire or the North East or the North West or wherever it might be. I mean, that would be a meaningful version of getting power out of Westminster and the City of London and put it into the hands of the people in those parts of the country. Because you're giving an institution that might do something, might actually have some power to reshape how the Yorkshire economy operates to the benefit of people who work there, in a way that, frankly, Westminster governments consistently haven't been able to do. There's an institutional failure there, and the City of London has no interest in doing whatsoever. And we know that on all the figures. It's why investment outside of London, the South East, certainly in England, is so weak. I mean, the interesting one in Scotland is how devolution since 1999 has changed that somewhat, that there's investment going to Scotland, and Scotland has closed, over some period of time, the long-standing gap with the rest of the country in terms of its GDP per head and this sort of thing. Getting some of that into England and getting meaningful transfer of power and wealth into the hands of people outside of basically the City of London and Westminster would be a very good, positive, progressive thing to do.
An argument that we hear from a lot of Labour supporters in Scotland is that when you're not happy with the government, you change the government and not your country. And, that's a very powerful argument. But when we're looking at two administrations in Westminster that have got a lot of similar policies, can you see why that comment just kind of looks really outdated?
I can't see why. I mean, also, you change your government to change your country, right? So, and changing your country ought to be a bigger conversation than just like, okay, we'll shuffle the government around and all the institutions stay the same. I mean, what we really need, and it's not just in Scotland, what you need across the whole of the United Kingdom is a big conversation about the kind of institutions we have, because the institutions we have are not delivering for most people. Right? There's a series of basically institutional failures. That ultimately gets you to a big constitutional question. If you're serious about institutional reform, you end up talking about what is the constitution of your country you're in. And there's a range of different answers to that, of which Scottish independence is a version of addressing that constitutional question. That's a decision for people in Scotland to make. For people in England, then we can't really be independent, but you can certainly think about what might be the institutions outside of Westminster, new institutions that are more democratic, closer in touch with people, and have some meaningful power to change people's lives. That isn't just, okay, here's a mayor, can do a few things, can't do, or she can do a few things, can't do very much. It's actually like, can you create tax-raising powers for them? Can you set up new banking institutions? Can you do these things that already shift power inside of England? And that's a sort of deep question that isn't just shuffle whoever's in charge at Westminster. That's like really fundamental reform.
Yeah, and we have that potential for that institutional reform because we have two parties in power who support a constitutional change in independence. But where do the people of England go for that alternative? Who do they vote for to see the institutional change that the country needs? Where is their democratic route to that potentially different society?
Well, it's building up ahead of steam. I mean, the Labour's the campaign for a new democracy inside of Labour, in other words, basically a campaign for electoral reform, which is a kind of first step towards this, is already building up support. Unite has come out in favour of it. Previously, it's the third time I mentioned it, Andy Burnham said he supports it now. There's quite powerful figures in the Labour movement, big institutions moving in this direction, because there's a recognition really that first past the post is not serving anybody particularly well. And in particular, it's actually not serving people in England particularly well, because there's no other representation that they get of any meaningful sense here. So that's one part of it. I think there's probably a much bigger question that we can start to see building up around what has happened with, inadvertently, because I don't think the Tories intended this to happen at all. It was George Osborne who launched the whole round of let's create some metro mayors and this sort of thing. They did not intend to create thorns in their side. That was not what they wanted, but they have done that, and that's good, and that's something to build on. So I think there's a head of steam building up around the demands that the mayors themselves are raising for more powers and potentially looking to other parts of the country and building similar institutions. So it's not going to be like necessarily one big shift at Westminster, here's your new political force that will deliver that. But I think inside the Labour Party, and potentially in alliance with some of the other smaller parties, Greens and Lib Dems are the most obvious ones here, you can start to see some of that change taking place.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Absolutely agree. I don't know if you've seen this website. It's called ourdemocracy.scot. It gives you the statistics on local representation. So, for example, the area that I have, you have one councillor for 4,743 people. In England, that's averagely about 2,814 people.
Right.
In Norway would have 572 people would be represented by one councillor. So, we really, really need a lot more democracy. And it's no wonder that people are disillusioned. We need more subsidiarity. And it's not just that I want to see Scotland be independent. I want to see much more subsidiarity after that as well, And I think you're right. In England, that definitely has to happen. And the first past the post system isn't serving anyone.
The thing needs a shake-up. And Labour's... It's for Scottish Labour to decide these things, but it's Scottish Labour's dogged commitment to the union and sort of pretty much refusal to consider even within the union, what it is you might do that would be different, like what kind of radical federalism might you have? You don't want independence, maybe you sort of go this far. I think is a real problem for it. It's a problem where you look at, I mean, just see it from direct experience with Corbynism, that you had a big surge in Labour membership in Wales and in England, like lots and lots of young people joining. Doesn't happen in Scotland. It happens a bit, but it's nothing to like the same extent. And there's kind of reason for that, and it's kind of built into Scottish Labour's absolute refusal to go anywhere near the sets of questions that have actually engaged lots and lots of young people in Scottish politics over the last, probably about nearly 10 years now, isn't it?
Yeah.